Nyati, thanks for starting the day with us. Now, as South Africans prepare for the tabling of the 2021 budget speech next week, we hone in on some of the economic challenges that lie ahead for Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Top of the list of priorities will be to stimulate South Africa's sluggish economic growth. To help us dissect some of these issues and their implications, I'm joined now in studio by development economist at Pax Africana Investment Holdings. That's, of course, Ndumiso. Hadebe. Ndumiso, thanks for your time. Welcome to Newsroom Africa.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy.
So, some people are already saying that if the finance minister is able to pull a rabbit out of the hole and give us the solution we all need to the many woes we're facing, the chances of us being able to stave off something like a junk status is, 0 to none. Take us through what the implications are of that prospect.
So the implications of a possible junk status downgrade by Moody's, who has upheld us at a stable outlook for quite some time now, would that South Africa would in essence not have access to over $50 billion worth of capital in the debt capital markets, which is usually a pool that we tap into whenever we need to fill in holes within our budget. So for instance, over the past fiscal years, we've had over 3 to 4% fiscal deficit in our budget, and in certain instances to finance certain programs, then we tap into those international debt markets in order to finance that. Although South Africa has been quite prudent in managing our budget because we only source dollar-based debt, and the composition of dollar-based debt is only 10% of our budget. Just so as to ensure that we don't have excessive budget, and in the event that our currency fluctuates or depreciates, then what that would essentially mean is that that debt would be bloated as a consequence of a depreciation of our currency. So that is quite a prudent framework in terms of reining in on that debt. However, what the Minister of Finance can do to sort of mitigate that would be to present a very credible budget in reining in on leakages from a fiscal leakage perspective, but also having credible interventions with respect to the South African airline, Eskom, and detailing that as over the past 3 years we've been expecting some detail around the unbundling into 3 separate entities and its different boards. And should the market buy into the credibility of the budget, then there's a potential that Moody's can return our outlook back to stable as a consequence of that.
And what does that buy-in need? I mean, is he meant to paint the picture as it is, or try, woo investors, to use that phrase once again? I mean, what exactly would the market be looking out for?
So it's really about the credibility of the plan. I think the numbers, when you look at that, they are as they are. Most of them, unfortunately, they're in negative territory. Although in 2018, the fixed investment that we attracted in South Africa did spike up, and of course it gradually subsided in 2019 because of the economic challenges that are driven by the state of our state-owned enterprises. So if indeed the plan around reining in on increasing debt levels, gross debt is expected to stabilize at around 62% by the year 2022-2023, which is the cap if we want to still remain safe from a junk status downgrade. Then those kinds of interventions may be something that investors may buy into. But of course, I think with some of the leakages, with some of the reports that we've come across from the Auditor General around the leakages at local government level, leakages from state-owned enterprises, and credible plans around state-owned enterprises as well, that can be bought into and pragmatic, because indeed we've been waiting for the past 3 years to have those credible plans, and the fact that some level of progress have been made. In that instance, then that could be something that an investor can buy into.
There's also been a lot of concerns around the Reserve Bank and the politics that pose a threat to its operations, so to speak. Would it help for the finance minister to reiterate whatever stance he'll choose on that day? Because we've heard of many over the past few weeks. I mean, does it help for a finance minister with the role that he plays to make a pronouncement of some of these politically charged issues?
I think the state has on a number of times affirmed the independent role of the Reserve Bank. I think even the president quite recently also affirmed it. I anticipate that Minister Mboweni would do that because national Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank coordinate on a regular basis with respect to the role of fiscal policy and monetary policy, because they're quite interlinked when it comes to setting out a framework that would boost employment, output, productive outcomes, and dealing with the question of growing inequalities in South Africa. So they need to coordinate on a frequent basis. So I do anticipate that he would affirm again the independent role of the South African Reserve Bank. Again, the question of nationalization, I think it's a question that has already been on the table, but the governor of the Reserve Bank has affirmed again that they're no longer considering opening or having that discussion again, because they're of the view that they've had that discussion enough, as it were.
There's talk, you speak about productive outcomes. One of, I guess, the legs of the state that are not very productive is our SOEs. You've touched on them in quite a bit. I mean, what can we expect insofar as the pronouncements they are concerned? Obviously, a lot of people are suggesting that more money will have to be given in the form of bailouts. Is that a move that you think the finance minister is likely to still entertain, given his personal, sometimes, sentiments over SOEs like SAA needing to be sold off?
I don't anticipate the finance minister to propose any bailouts. I think previously, in the previous budget, he had outlined that the preconditions or the precursor for any sort of bailout, as it were, would be there would have to be certain conditions that are met by state-owned companies. And in this particular instance, any sort of capitalization of state-owned companies would be in the form of equity, as opposed to it being a blank check that is consistently written, but there are certain conditions that would have to be met. We've seen with the state airline quite recently and the struggle for them to raise 2 billion rand from National Treasury. As a consequence, the Development Bank of South Africa was able to fill in or plug in that particular hole. So as a result of that, I don't anticipate that he would be on a stance to write blank checks. I would anticipate that he would affirm the stance that he previously had around no blank checks would be written, specific interventions would have to be met in order for them to receive capitalization, but also the work of the business rescue practitioners as well, and the progress that they're making, and the anticipated outcomes as to how should these state-owned enterprises be repurposed for development, because that's what state-owned enterprises are for. 40% of the economic output that we see in our economy is driven by state-owned companies. So if there are changes in industry and there's evolutions in terms of how industries operate, then state-owned enterprises need to be repurposed and re-engineered to still serve that developmental mandate, as it were.
And that's if we give the BRPs the space to do their work, right? That's where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you very much for your time and for your insights. Ndumiso Hadebe is a development economist and director at Pax Africana Investment Holdings. Once again, thanks for coming through.
Thanks, Andy.